There is a specific kind of look that some children have. It's hard to describe unless you've seen it. It's not sadness exactly. It's not fear. It's something closer to awareness. A steadiness in the eyes that doesn't quite belong to someone that age. Like they've already understood something about the world that most people spend decades arriving at. And if you've ever seen that look, you probably recognized it. Maybe because you've seen it in photographs of yourself. Some people learn life too early. Not because someone sat them down and explained it, but because life didn't wait for them to be ready. Maybe it was a household where the adults were struggling and the child quietly absorbed the weight of that struggle without anyone asking them to. Maybe it was grief arriving before they had the language for it. Maybe it was poverty that made certain conversations impossible to avoid, or instability that replaced childhood routines with something more unpredictable. Maybe it was simply a moment, one specific moment, where something shifted, and the version of themselves that existed before that moment never quite came back. Whatever the shape of it, the experience leaves a particular imprint. And understanding that imprint, understanding what it actually does to a person over time, is what this is about. The first thing that happens is a compression of time. Psychologists who study child development talk about something called age-appropriate processing, the idea that children absorb experiences differently depending on the cognitive and emotional tools they have available at each stage. When a child encounters something that exceeds those tools, the mind doesn't simply reject it, it stores it, unprocessed, like a file too large for the system to open. The child continues forward, but the file stays. This is why people who learned life too early often describe a strange relationship with their own childhood. They remember it clearly in some ways, they can recall the facts of it without difficulty, but the emotional texture is muted, compressed, almost clinical. They will tell you what happened in the tone of someone reporting information rather than reliving a memory. Not because it didn't affect them, but because affecting them and processing it are two entirely different things. And for many of them, the processing happens decades later, quietly, in the middle of an ordinary evening, when something small unlocks a door they didn't know was still closed. One of the most consistent patterns in these individuals is what I'd describe as an advanced theory of mind. Because when you are a child navigating a world that is asking adult things of you, you develop adult tools for reading people, fast, out of necessity. You become very good at sensing the emotional temperature of a room before you even sit down. You learn to read tension in someone's posture, in the specific silence before someone speaks, in the way a door closes just slightly harder than usual. You don't develop this skill in a classroom. You develop it because once, a long time ago, reading those signals accurately mattered in a way it shouldn't have mattered to someone your age. And that skill follows you into every relationship, every professional dynamic, every new room you walk into. People around you will sometimes marvel at your perceptiveness. They'll call it intuition. They'll call it emotional intelligence. And in some ways it is. But there's another name for it too. Survival. Dressed up in more comfortable language, but here's where it becomes more complex and more important to understand. People who grew up too fast often carry a very specific confusion about their own needs. Because the child who stepped into responsibility early did so, at least in part, by suppressing. They suppressed the need for reassurance because there was no one available to provide it. They suppressed the need for play because play felt irresponsible given the circumstances. They suppressed fear, confusion, the ordinary overwhelm of just being young because the environment made those things feel like luxuries. And the mind adapts beautifully, terribly beautifully. It learns not to generate those signals as loudly. Over time, the individual genuinely stops noticing certain needs, not because the needs disappeared, but because the neural pathways that once carried them were quietly rerouted. What remains is a person who functions remarkably well under pressure, who rarely complains, who can hold a great deal without visibly cracking, and who will occasionally, without warning, find themselves flooded by an emotion they cannot immediately name. A grief that seems too large for the situation, a longing that arrives without a clear object, an exhaustion that sleep does not fix. These are the stored files, opening slowly, finally finding the processing they were denied years ago. There's a particular relationship with responsibility that develops in these individuals that is worth examining carefully. They do not treat responsibility the way most people do. For most people, responsibility is something assumed gradually, willingly, as part of a natural progression. But for someone who learned life early, responsibility arrived uninvited. And in arriving that way, it planted something complicated. A sense that being responsible is not a choice, but a condition. That without their management, something falls apart. That the appropriate response to any situation is to immediately locate the problem and move toward it. This can produce extraordinary capability. These are often the people who rise in organizations, who stabilize families, who others describe as dependable beyond measure. But beneath that capability is sometimes a profound inability to rest. Because rest, for someone whose vigilance once served a real purpose, can feel like exposure. Like the moment you let go of the rope is the moment everything unravels. Even when there is no longer any rope, even when the crisis ended years ago, the nervous system doesn't always receive that message cleanly. And then there is the grief. Not the grief of a specific loss, but what psychologists sometimes call ambiguous grief. The mourning of a childhood that existed in fragments or didn't exist in the form it was supposed to. This grief is tricky because it has no clean object. You cannot point to the thing that was lost as clearly as you can point to a person or a place. The loss is more like a shape that was supposed to be there and wasn't. The ordinary carelessness of childhood. The specific irresponsibility that children are supposed to be allowed. The simple permission to not understand things yet. People who learn life too early often feel this grief most acutely around other people's childhoods. Watching a child be entirely, carelessly absorbed in something small, a game, a toy, a piece of imagination, and feeling in their chest a particular ache that they might not be able to articulate, but which is essentially the recognition of something they reached for and couldn't quite hold. Something that moved on before they got to it. But here's what I want to say most carefully, because it is where this conversation usually stops too soon. The people who learn life early did not only lose something, they also built something. Something real and something that belongs entirely to them. They built a relationship with reality that most people never develop. Not a cynical one, not a bitter one, but a clear-eyed one. The world, for them, is not a place that operates on wishful thinking. They understand consequences at a granular level. They understand that things do not fix themselves, that time alone does not heal what isn't addressed, that the people and moments you value are not permanent and therefore should be treated with attention now, not later. These are not ideas they read in books. These are things they know in the way you know things that have been lived rather than learned. They often carry a very particular kind of gratitude, one that comes from understanding lack. They do not take ordinary stability for granted. A quiet evening, a meal shared without tension, a relationship in which trust has been maintained. These things register in them with a depth that someone who always had them simply cannot access in the same way. They know the cost of their absence. And there is something else, something that is perhaps the most underappreciated aspect of growing up too fast. These individuals often possess an unusually sophisticated understanding of human complexity. Because when you have seen adults be both caring and failing, both loving and limited, both present and completely absent in the same breath, you stop expecting people to be one thing. You understand, from a very early age, that people are contradictions, that strength and weakness live in the same person, that someone can love you and still not give you what you needed, that intention and impact are not always the same thing. This understanding makes them, at their best, extraordinarily compassionate. Not naive compassion, not the kind that denies difficulty, but the kind that can hold difficulty and humanity in the same view without needing to collapse one into the other. If you are someone who recognizes yourself in this, I want to say something directly. The life you were handed early was not a curriculum. It was not preparation. It was not building character in some designed, purposeful way. It was simply circumstances that asked too much of someone who deserved more time. The strength you built from it is yours, but it was built under conditions that weren't fair. And acknowledging that, not as an excuse, not as a permanent identity, but simply as the truth, is not weakness. It is the beginning of something more honest than the story that says you are simply built different, simply stronger, simply beyond needing what everyone else needs. You needed it. You just didn't always get it. And those two facts can exist at the same time. People who learn life too early often spend years living from the part of themselves that formed under pressure. Capable, perceptive, responsible, resilient. And all of that is real. All of that counts. But there is also the part that formed before the pressure arrived. The part that existed in the small window before the weight came. That part did not disappear. It got quiet. It learned to take up less space, but it is still in there, patient in a way that is almost heartbreaking. Still hoping, without quite using that word, for the ordinary tenderness it didn't get enough of the first time. And the extraordinary thing is this: it is not too late for that part. Development, emotional development, does not end at the age it was interrupted. It resumes. Given the right conditions, the right relationships, the right quality of attention, both from others and from yourself, it resumes. Slowly. Non-linearly. With setbacks that feel like starting over, but aren't. But it resumes. The child who had to grow up too fast does not have to stay grown up in the same rigid, unrelenting way forever. That was a response to a season. The season changed. Even if the nervous system hasn't fully received that news yet, give it time. Give it evidence. Give it people who make the ordinary tenderness feel safe enough to accept without suspicion. And watch what becomes possible in someone who was always, beneath all of that extraordinary competence, simply a person who arrived at adulthood too soon and quietly never stopped hoping to find their way back to something softer.